Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. We are going to do something today that is somewhat of a rarity for us. We're going to talk about a collection of short stories. And I can tell you right away that the only reason we're doing it is because I fell in love with the collection, with some of the stories in particular. The name of the collection is Birds of a Lesser Paradise, and it's also one of the stories has that title. And stories are by Megan Mayhew Bergman, and the publisher is Scribner. And Megan has stopped by. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
You are described in a place called About the Author. Megan Mayhew Bergman grew up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and attended Wake Forest University. Wake Forest is playing Notre Dame on Saturday.
Oh, my.
Yes, she has graduate degrees from Duke University and Bennington College. And then toward the end it says, she lives in Vermont with her veterinarian husband, their 2 daughters, 3 dogs, 4 cats, a horse, goats, and chickens. And my question is, no bears?
Actually, we do. They visit us at night, and the dogs go crazy. I
thought so. Beyond the tree line, as it's said in many of the stories. Now, clearly animals have to be one of the themes, if you will, of this collection. But I think there are some deeper themes, too. One that seems clear to me is what all living things share. As you put it, they share the urge to exist and persist, and it's a struggle that they all share. This idea is at the heart of all your stories. That's what you say.
I did say it.
When did you decide that?
Well, I think that idea first came to me at Wake Forest University in North Carolina.
North Carolina?
When I was an anthropology major, which was something my parents weren't thrilled about. But I must say that the anthropological background does inform the writing. And
why weren't they thrilled? Is anthropology unladylike?
Well, it might be a little unladylike, but it's also terribly unmarketable.
True, okay.
But for a writer, anything goes. But I loved it. I was passionate about it and was introduced to, it's the study of people and culture and the root of our behavior, that sort of convergence of biology and nature and nurture, and that all fascinates me. And you may have noticed I started the collection off with the quote from Darwin, which is, we will now discuss in a little more detail the struggle for existence. And I wrote these stories at a time in my life where I felt that I was starting to understand the struggle, in quotation marks, a little more.
I see. Another possible theme is the quest for the possibility of living in real freedom. As the wife in a story called The Right Company says, upon leaving her husband, maybe this was my chance to live the way I wanted to live. And where? Sure, I'd be lonely. Sure, I'd crave companionship. But the idea of real freedom was seductive. What a great word, seductive. And that becomes a kind of theme, I think, doesn't it?
It does. I think I was at a point in my life, I'd just had my first child, and that causes a woman, I think, to undergo a sort of radical evaluation of selfhood and wants and desires and needs and where that's all going to go.
Yeah, like I don't have any anymore. It's all in the child.
Right.
Yeah.
It's, it's what we in the South call a come to Jesus moment. You get real. You evaluate things. And I was doing a lot of that as I was writing these stories, but also thinking about what is happiness and how do we claim it and how do we get there? And do we make decisions for ourselves as an individual or as a family or a group? And that sort of negotiation that begins.
Yeah, I guess the large question is, do we ever make decisions as a single entity, or is it always in the context of other environment, people around us, and so on?
Yeah, I would say I don't have a prescriptive answer to that question, but it's certainly the question itself that I was pursuing, I think, that discovery in a lot of these stories. Some anthropologists would say that there is a sort of selfish root to most of our behaviors. But then other writers like E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, might say, no, altruism exists, and we do make decisions for others, and it's a fascinating question to ask oneself.
Yeah, and then finally there's the theme that I think is hard to express, although I'm sure it's very important to you. The stories give us insight into the impressive power that nature has over all of us, as when a character drives hundreds of miles to hear her mother's voice in the voice of a pet bird. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. It is, the power of nature is important to me. There have been some terrific books lately about nature deficit and our lost connection to nature, and I felt that connection reestablished more for me when I married into a family of veterinarians, where suddenly, animal life...
It's a family
It's
of
a family of veterinarians.
Oh,
my
dear.
husband and his parents, right. That's right. And so also with the anthropology background, I was very consumed with thinking about these sort of vestigial instincts that we have. I mean, that we are still members of the animal kingdom, and that we might, as parents or in relationships, be surprised about these sort of instincts that flare up within us.
Those vestigial instincts are something that you surely experience in and around childbirth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, enough of themes and theories. When we come back, we're going to talk about a story or two, like housewifely arts.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Birds of a Lesser Paradise. That's the story of this. That's the title of these stories by Megan Mayhew Bergman, who has joined us today. And our friends at the Boston Globe said in part about this collection, these stories are a pleasure to read, and their animal motifs provide insight into the human condition, and sometimes vice versa. Bergman possesses a crisp and often poetic voice and wily, intelligent humor. I don't think I've ever met a person with wily humor, and I feel very fortunate now to have done that. And since your voice is also crisp and poetic, I think we should hear it from the title story, Birds of a Lesser Paradise. The dad in the story is dying. He's about to go into the hospital for heart surgery, and his daughter May is speaking. Anything else in context we should say? There's a dog mentioned.
There's always a dog.
Always a dog.
The dog is named
either a
Betsy.
dog or a veterinarian.
That's right.
Yeah. Please.
Okay. The night before his surgery, Dad went to bed early. I cleaned the kitchen and stared at his closed door. I missed him already. I walked down the hall and knocked. "Can I come in?" I asked. He was propped on his pillows, Betsy sleeping against his feet. She looked up as I entered. His television was not on. There was no book in his hands. He'd placed a picture of my mother on his nightstand. I opened a window. "For the morning," I said, "so you can hear them sing." He didn't speak, but reached for my hand. The air was too warm, but we were used to it. The crickets were loud, and I let their noise chip away at my worries. I rubbed my father's rough hands with my thumb. "I did see one," he said, once. I'm positive. It was the real thing, a bill the color of chalk. Somewhere in the distance, a train ran over the old swamp tracks Dad had followed in and out of the swamp as a boy, tracks he'd known before he fell in love, before he spent 2 years grading our backyard into a golfing green. He'd seen the last wild things, the early hunting cabins, the last virgin timber, and maybe even the last living ivory-billed woodpecker. He'd seen the last great bucks, the last great hunters, the skin-laden trappers emerging from the woods at dawn smelling of sulfur and musk. His family had made it through the Depression selling mink. I'd once watched Dad carefully tug the mangled body of one from a chicken wire fence, desperate to save the skin. He still ate the chickweed and creasy greens that had been self-seeding in the backyard since his father's time. Dad's old-school frugality was harsh, endearing, maybe a lost art. "Will you put socks on the bed?" he said, "in case I get cold?" The rhythm of the crickets outside muffled traffic, and every now and then the clear note of a jay cut through the air like a circular saw. Maybe it wasn't the same as it had been when I was a child, but the swamp remained a wild place, wild enough to hide whatever wanted to be hidden. "You had a good childhood here," he said. It was the beginning of a goodbye that I didn't want to hear. Even if he made it through the surgery, he'd be a different man, older, more careful. I could smell the swamp rose, harlot pink and fragrant in the hot night, dry magnolia leaves scratched against the vinyl siding of the house. Dad relaxed into his pillow. Betsy fell asleep, no longer on guard. For minutes, maybe an hour, I held his hand, and I think he slept. I wished for things to stay the same. I wished for stillness everywhere, but I opened up the rest of the bedroom windows and let the world in.
I asked the question, is this not a good example of seeing things as they really happen, as they happen in the grasp of nature, in the grasp of the whole world? Isn't that what that's about?
It is.
So it is an example of that last theme that we were talking about.
Exactly, yeah.
And the other thing is how hard you must have worked to get certain things just right. I could smell the swamp rose, harlot pink and fragrant in the hot night. Harlot pink and fragrant. I mean, that just doesn't come like that. Or maybe it does to you. I don't know.
Well, every now and then when I'm about to fall asleep or when I'm waking up, something brilliant does strike. But you're right, it's work. I'll get an image or an idea or a string of words and put them down, and it's a little bit of research, a little bit of inspiration, and then the polishing up.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. May it always be thus.
May it.
May it always, especially when you're working on the novel.
That's right.
As you are now. The other thing that strikes me about this particular story is how apt the title is. Birds of a Lesser Paradise, a swamp. You know, to see paradise in that kind of place where one's first thought, at least mine, is smell.
Yeah.
And heat.
Yeah.
And sweat and humidity. And here it is, just a lesser paradise, but a paradise all the same.
That's right. I think these characters find it beautiful in that it's raw and primal and untouched and a little bit more wild than the rest of the world, but less wild every day, and they're recognizing that process. And another one of my stories, Yesterday's Whales, a character comments that the world has lost a little bit of its freshness, and that's one of the ways I see the lesser paradise functioning, just that the world still retains its natural beauty, but perhaps it's waning a little. Yeah,
it's being taken away.
Right.
By highways still, I suppose, in certain parts of the country. The Artificial Heart, which is the title of one of the other stories, I think, has some of the funnier lines in the book. In fact, I think the way it opens is a good example of that lighter approach. It begins, "My father was 91 and senile, but insisted he could still look for love. The dating service paired him with Susan, an octogenarian feminist who listed skee-ball and container gardening as her primary hobbies. She was in the early stages of Alzheimer's and chewed nicotine gum when she talked. They'd been dating a month, and when he was lucid, Dad was smitten."
Yeah.
I like that opening. That's wonderful. "Companionship of any kind is important," the dating service director assured me on the eve of their first date. "The couple comes to the senior center, and we serve them a steak dinner." I don't know where that senior center is. I'm going to go. "Followed by tea and cheesecake on the center terrace. Love keeps them in the present. A relationship is a tether to the future."
Yeah, I loved the sort of collision of commercialism and instinct and need for love, and I'm glad that you appreciate that opening as well. It's one of my favorites.
Birds of a Lesser Paradise is a book everyone should read for its wonderfully told truths, and we'll take a look at a few more of those when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Megan Mayhew Bergman. That's a great name, and you better remember it because she's working on a novel. It's going to be fantastic, just as this book is. This book is the book we're talking about today. It's called Birds of a Lesser Paradise. It is published by Scribner and a pretty successful author. Name is Sarah Gruen, who wrote a book called Water for Elephants. That made several $million for that person. Remember, it was a film and all that kind of stuff. At any rate, Sarah says, Birds of a Lesser Paradise is an astonishing debut collection by a writer reminiscent of such greats as, sit down, folks, Alice Munro, Elizabeth Strout, and even Chekhov. Who I love the Chekhov thing. That really puts you up there.
It was kind.
It's expertly delivered. Bergman's stories bloom from the minutiae of life. They confirm the inescapable power that nature and our own biology has over us. And that's a point that we've been kind of touching on here in our chat together. And it's fascinating. The more we talk about it, the more we think about it, the more fascinating it becomes. The most autobiographical story, in my opinion, though Megan disagrees, is the $2,000 sock. And you think it's what?
I think it's the cow that milked herself.
Yeah, but I don't care. I don't like that.
I know. That's all right. I appreciate your honesty.
Okay. Now, the $2,000 sock is a sock that's embedded, not like a reporter, in the insides of a pet dog, and there's a part in it that I'd like to read. When we returned home from the vet, I propped Poppy on my left hip and took a walk around the property. Now, Poppy is a child. Am I correct?
You're correct.
Sometimes the names here are a little strange. The sunflowers were budding. The corn was calf-high. The barn swallows swooped over us like stunt pilots. And that, again, I mean, nobody in this work takes a walk without being able to see where the person is walking and what they're seeing. You usually, Vito, that's the dog.
That's
Vito
right.
usually took the walk with us, his back sloped and hips low, nose to the ground. I missed his lithe body weaving through the grass, brushing against my legs. I missed watching him charge the moles and chipmunks that lived beneath the brush pile, sprint after the garbage trucks that used our driveway for a turnaround. He was a runner, a stalker, a too-fast to call off dog. And he's dying.
He is.
And he's dying. And that really is the whole story there. But, of course, it's also the story of how the humans relate to this passing. And I won't say how the dog ends, but it's poetic. And it's a great story.
Thank you. Thank you.
But it's not the most autobiographical, even though there's a veterinarian in it.
That's right. Well, there is. You're definitely seizing upon a very autobiographical element, and that's my husband as a veterinarian in a rural community. Is constantly working with clients who care so much about their animals, but they don't have the finances to perhaps give them the medical care that they need in a critical situation. And it's a really painful priority, and it's also difficult for my husband to coach them through those situations. There's what business sense would have him do, but there's what his heart would have him do also, and helping people make these difficult decisions.
On a personal note, we have an aging cat, and any animal that ages needs more veterinarian attention than a young one. And when they started saying, well, this is what you should be doing now, you should be running this kind of test and that kind of test, and then and you start asking what it costs, and, you practically fall over in a faint.
Yeah. The collision of love and money is an ugly thing. Yeah.
It certainly is. It certainly is. The opening story has an interesting title called Housewifely Arts. And the setup for that story is describe this person who can make sandwiches like crazy, change a diaper, and also change the oil in a car.
Yeah.
I guess this is the self-sufficient modern woman.
I like plucky women. I like scrappy self-starters.
Okay.
Women not afraid to get their hands dirty.
Okay. There's the other main character in that story is a bird.
Yeah.
The bird's name is Carney.
Mm-hmm.
And the amazing part here is that Carney could imitate perfectly the mother of the main character's voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that mother dies.
Yes.
And she goes off to find Carney and listen.
Yeah. And the startling thing here is that's true. My husband's family had a parrot named Carney. I hope birds aren't litigious. But this bird did have my mother-in-law's voice in it. And when my mother-in-law passed away 3 years ago, I kept thinking somewhere in the world there's an African gray parrot that may be 70 years old that still has the last kernel of her voice. So that's actually a true element to this story.
Well, to find out the other elements of this story and what happens to Carney, you're going to have to go out and get your own copy of Birds of a Lesser Paradise by Megan Mayhew Bergman. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.